And so we were in Singapore at the naval base, not actually, we were anchored in the Johor Strait off the naval base. And then of course the Japanese entered the war on the midnight of the 7th, 8th in our time. And the Japanese bombed Singapore on about 4 o'clock in the morning. They had no difficulty in finding their target because the city was a blaze of lights. There was no sort of any warning of that danger was so close.
We got bombed in Singapore harbour, and I was doing stoppage of leave for some. I was always in trouble. And I was doing stoppage of leave, and so many were ashore, and I thought, if a bomb drops here, I'm dead. So I dashed down. I had the ability, the companionway is a stairway sort of thing, and I got brass rails on the side. And being young and like a monkey, I was tearing around all over the place. I could hold this, put my 2 legs out and straight down without, so I went right down in the engine room, so if a bomb dropped, I'd live. Because it'd go up before it went there. And then I could hear vroom, vroom. And I thought, if one lands alongside the warship and the plates will open up, the sea will pour in and I'll drown. So there I was with all the different decks, I'm right in the middle. So they go both ways, anyway, they left. Next day we left, it was the next day, the day after, the next day. And we went past 2 beautiful ships, Prince of Wales and Repulse. Everything brass and shiny, everything was absolutely perfect. And we sort of looked at it and wished we were on that. So we left there and went into a northerly direction up towards Calcutta, where we arrived later. And the Prince of Wales and Repulse left after us and went around and went the other way up the coast of Malaysia. And about 2-3 days later, they were sunk.
And then the dear old ship, you could feel her going down like standing in the bathtub with the plug out, as the water came in. And so a bound ship was given, people got off, those that could. And destroyers then picked up the people swimming, those who could. And that was sort of the end of the ship sank at 12:33, virtually about within 10 minutes of the beginning of the attack. And it was a sad, sad day because we lost over 500 officers and sailors from a ship's company of about 1,300. Prince of Wales sank a little while later, picked up the survivors, and we were taken back to Singapore.
Where I went into action at Manoora, the 2nd 29th Battalion, Victorian Battalion, had been sent to oppose a supposedly small force of Japanese that were stationed at Manoora. They were going across the river. Unfortunately, the few Japanese, they said it was a small force, turned out to be the Imperial Japanese Guards Division, superbly trained troops. Well, they held them up for 4 days, which was incredible, considering a small force like that against a full division. And the 2nd 19th Battalion, which was the New South Wales Battalion, had been sent up to reinforce the 2nd 29th, so they were coming up the road to reinforce. They then met the Japanese, of course, that had gone around us. So they met them, so they were trying to fight their way up to us. Then after 4 days, we realised that the commanding officer, 2nd 29th, had been killed. They realised that we couldn't hold them any longer, so they made a fighting withdrawal back to join the 2nd 19th. So unfortunately we had to leave our guns behind. We couldn't bring our guns with us, so we just walked out with the infantry, so we made a fighting withdrawal.
We moved around a few defensive positions before we set up an ambush at Griffiths. which was, from our point of view, very satisfactory, you know. Annihilated a few Japs. And then the next day, it was head on, and you know, we were in danger of being surrounded, so we retreated. That was the story right down the peninsula. I got visions of them flying overhead, 27 of them, you know, all in groups of 3, you know, 9s and 3 sets of 9s. Perfect formation. They were flying over us towards Singapore. You know, dominated the skies. That was a real plus for them.
When we got back onto Singapore Island, there was not a strand of barbed wire erected, there was not a trench dug, there was nothing. Singapore was never, ever an impregnable fortress.
We arrived in Singapore on the 1st of February 1942. We stayed there till the 2nd, and it was utter chaos. And of course we left there, and those poor people that we'd taken, fortnight later they were in a POW camp. And I was on the wharf, and all these poor Australian soldiers were being cut off from the units or whatever, and they were wandering up and down the wharfs, saying, "Which ship's going back to Australia, mate?" The Japanese are in just over they're waiting on the Johor side of the strait to come over. And as I said, it was all over in 14 days.
The artillery did a good job, all our mob did a good job, and the Japanese were surprised at the reception they received. They lost heavily, very heavily. But we couldn't stay there, had to, in case of moving back anyway. That's just the way it went. Eventually the Japanese captured the only 2 water reservoirs in Singapore, turned off the taps, and there was no water. Going in Singapore City, there was no water to wash, to drink, toilets, anything.
It's a 20-mile march sort of thing up to Changi prison, where there was the gathering place. So that was it. We had to make. It took all day for us to march in the heat. I think they sent us to Japan in the Northern Ireland to start with in the middle of winter. There, Christmas in November, which up there was snow, but that was. Probably, well, we lost 20 in the first few months there, just from the cold and that, you know, was the big killer. You were better off staying in Singapore. Japan was killer sort of thing.
People speak of Changi, you know, well, you're in Changi as if it was some horrible camp like Balsam or one of those, but Changi, compared to what went on up in Thailand, was, it was just nothing. I would have been happy to have stayed in Changi for 3.5 years on that. I went up to Thailand in March 1943 on D-Force. We were 30 men to a steel rice truck, enclosed rice steel truck. Fortunately, the doors were open with the Japs sitting at the door. 30 men to a truck for a 5-day journey to Bangkok. So that was, you know, not a very pleasant journey. I can remember marching into my camp, which was Conyu 2 on the railway, on Anzac Day, 1943.
When I first arrived in Burma, as I said, my brother had already gone up there. When we came through, when they brought us through in trucks to our first camp, the 28 kilo camp, the word must have got through that we were coming through, because I saw my brother on the side of the road as we went through. He called out and he had a hat full of cigarettes. He didn't smoke, of course, and he saved all these cigarettes. It was like throwing gold to me. And he threw this hat full of cigarettes up to me onto the both sides of the truck. I got most of them, but I didn't get them all. Yeah, it was like throwing a hat full of gold, you know, because they could use those cigarettes to barter for food and all sorts of things. But that was actually the last time I saw him. I was going through. Yeah.
My camp was below the one which you probably heard of, Hellfire Pass. Well, that was the biggest cutting on the railway. The one that we had was only a small cutting. So we had a small cutting and embankment. So we had what we called hammer and tack men, where you had a steel rod with a pointy end and a fellow with a 7-pound sledgehammer. So you held the rod while he belted the end of it, and he turned it. So he bored a hole in the rock, and then when they had enough holes they wanted to use in that particular section, they put dynamite in and blow the rock. And then we'd have to clear the rock. All we had was a rice sack with 2 bamboo poles shoved through each side, and that's how you carried the dirt and the rock. No wheelbarrows. It's incredible, isn't it? Yeah, but that's how all the dirt and the rock was moved.
We'd get out of the quarry, hide behind trees, and the Japs would light the fuses and blast all the rocks down. And then the next job we had to do was to break all these great big bluestone boulders up. Break them up first with an 8-pound hammer. We'd then go ahead and break them up with napping hammers, as they call them, and nap them down to the size of 2 or 3 inches in diameter, to use as ballast for the railway sleepers, to put under the railway sleepers.
And you couldn't just knock off your work in the railway and go and have a drink until they told you to have a rest, which wasn't very often, what they called yasmi. It didn't happen very often. They might give you a 10 or a 15 minute, but it didn't happen. Once speedo came in, there's no breaks in. Go, go, go.
That quarry work was responsible for so many ulcers that developed on the legs through cuts received in the quarry, which became infected and developed into tropical ulcers.
I was right next to the ulcer ward, and the people with ulcers, and I'm not talking about tiny little ulcers, sometimes they're huge and take up all the shin, and they used to have to be cleaned each morning. The only means of cleaning those was with a sharpened spoon with no anaesthetic. So you can imagine the pain, the screaming. Terrible. And they were men above men, the doctors on the Thai-Burma railway. Absolutely, the way they fought to, like the Japanese would say, we wanted so many men for working party. So they'd line the fit men up, and they might be 5 or 10 men short. So they'd pull all the men out of the hospital tent. And if you could stand, you were fit enough to go to work. And the doctor would fight then, trying to keep his sick men off the line.
I remember one day it must have been the malaria, but I was coming home from one of those work parties one day, and I started to feel very odd, and I felt as though I was walking up a hill like that. I must have been just about passed out. And one of my mates, I was pretty thin, I suppose. One of my mates picked me up, slung me across the shoulder. Carried me home.
Because the malaria, when we got malaria, unfortunately with no treatment, you just lay there and you feel terrible and you get the shivers and you sweat and you're hot and you certainly don't feel like eating. So your other mates would get your rice and they'd share that amongst themselves, and then when they got malaria, which we all did in our turn, you'd share their rice around.
Everybody was hungry every day, every minute of the day. You were always hungry because you never had enough to eat. The breakfast of the morning was pappy rice, which is watery rice.
So you get a cup of that, and that's what you went out and worked on the railway on. You know, no sugar, no salt, nothing. And that's what you went out and worked on the railway on. And then at lunchtime, you took your lunch out, so your rice would be sour by the time you got to it. Might get something a bit dry to eat with it, but then at night time you get another mug of rice and hopefully a watery pumpkin stew with maybe a few other little veggies thrown in or something.
You were that hungry that even this rotten food we did, there were times when I would say to my mates, geez, that was great, you know, because I was that hungry. I was that hungry it even tasted good, even the rotten food we were getting tasted good.
We never had beds. They built our huts and they were all a platform of bamboo, the big bamboo which had been cut out and flattened. So we slept on bamboo slats, alongside each other. But you never had your own individual bed or anything like that. Yeah. And they always got full of bed bugs, these little bugs that they'd bite you and suck the blood. Oh, terrible things they were.
The toilets were just a hole in a great big pit in the ground about 8 foot deep, they'd be about 6 foot wide and about 20 foot long, with bamboo across the top and just little openings on the bamboo to do your business through. And during that wet season, the pit had filled up pretty well with water, and of course the maggots were everywhere. You got the toilet, your bare feet, you stand on these slats, and the maggots will be crawling up your legs.
Our morale during those 3.5 years was fantastic. You know, we'd been taken prisoner, we accepted that. You adapt to the conditions, particularly up in Thailand, but our morale never ever lost it, never ever lost it. We're never beaten.
When the war ended, we had we didn't know, but we've been called on a parade to go to work on a work party. We went out, fell in, got on parade, and we stood on parade for about an hour. Nobody came. And the following day, about 7 o'clock in the morning, just on daybreak, this group of about half a dozen commandos came through the gate into the camp. They were armed to the teeth. There was a few Americans and a number of British commandos. This was about a week after the war had finished. By that time, after the Japanese had surrendered. We've been going to work all that time the war was over. And that's how we found out the war had finished.
One of the fellas came, he said, "It's all over, fellas." I said, "Don't be silly. They're saying that for 3.5 years. No, I think it's right this time." No. One of the group said, "Oh, I know, fellas, the wireless, I'll go and find out." And he did, and he went away, and it was a long time. And when he came back, he said, "That's right, it's all finished. The Japs have surrendered, but we must act as normal because the guards don't know."
And we're marching out this day, excuse me, and all of a sudden they turned us around. So, hello, what's going on here? So it took us all back to camp. So they lined us up on the parade ground, and we had an English Sergeant Major in charge of our camp. And he lined us up and he said, "The war is over." He said, "An atomic bomb has been dropped on Japan and the war is over." So we wouldn't have cared if it had been a custard tart that had been dropped on Japan that finished the war, but it was over and we'd survived.
And I must say it was the most incredible feeling of relief. Incredible feeling. So really, we're not going to have to shoot anymore. Really, you know, tomorrow is an ordinary day, you know, what's it going to be like?
We left Singapore and with a naval escort, and the sea was calm, and we pulled into Darwin, which was good. The people at Darwin were magnificent. Oh, they adopted us for the day. Took us all around Darwin. They fed us, they showed us a picture at night, took us back to the ship, and off we go to Brisbane's the next. And we're moving so slowly through the waters, trying to feed us up by the time we got back. Turned south to go back to go down to Sydney. I said to one of the officers, "Crew, what time are we likely to pass Nobbies?" "Oh, about 1 o'clock in the morning." "Thank you." So we got going back home to bed. I woke up, looked at the watch, nearly 1 o'clock. I didn't have a watch. Somebody had a watch. I did flog mine earlier. Got up. There was Nobbies. We're nearly home.